Have you ever felt that something was wrong but couldn't quite put your finger on it? Imagine being in an isolated environment where the faces around you seem unshakable, as if time has never touched them. You enter an abandoned space station, only to discover that it has been forgotten, but not by the stars, by death itself. Every inhabitant seems to have frozen in time, with the same faces, the same gestures, but without the memory of what trapped them there. As you explore its cold, empty corridors, you don't hear screams or wails. You hear silence, a silence so thick it feels like a presence, a consciousness, something you don't yet understand, but which is already watching every one of your moves. Something that made the inhabitants of this station forget how to die. The Horizon Station had always been an enigma, but not one that bothered the authorities. Located millions of kilometers from Earth, lost in the vastness of deep space, far from common navigation routes, its mission was simple: to collect data and conduct long-term experiments. However, one fact always intrigued the few crews who visited the site. It only ever received a visit once every decade. The silence of its abandonment seemed constant, and after the last mission in 2043, nothing more was heard from its inhabitants. When the new crew arrived at the station, what they found wasn't the apocalyptic scene of an empty, abandoned place as expected. There were no wrecks, no signs of system failures. The station seemed to be in perfect working condition, as if it had never been touched by time. What bothered them most was the behavior of the station's crew, who were completely immune to the effects of the passing years. They didn't age. Their facial expressions, their movements, everything seemed frozen in time. Captain Emily Strickland felt a chill in her stomach as she looked at the faces of the former occupants of Horizon. It was as if they were waiting for her, as if they knew that the moment of her arrival had been predestined. But that didn't make sense. Emily glanced at the members of her crew, feeling a growing tension, but none of them seemed as uncomfortable as she was. What could have happened here? How had these scientists and engineers not aged? And, most intriguingly, why did none of them seem to have any memory of when or how they had come to this state? They were greeted with a cordial smile, but without explanations, as if the lack of answers was a common occurrence in this place. During the conversation, a strange sensation began to spread through Emily's crew. It didn't seem to be just the absence of answers. It was more like the very inhabitants of Horizon were trapped in a routine, a repetitive cycle that kept them from moving forward, as if they were stuck within the station itself, physically present but mentally absent. Chief Engineer Richard Holt was the first to question the state of things. He pulled Emily aside, whispering with a worried expression, "Something's not right, Captain. These people, they don't have the marks of time on them. No one remembers how they got here. There are no records of their activities in recent years, and the station's monitoring systems show no failure in the process." But the most disturbing thing was the look on the faces of the Horizon inhabitants. There wasn't a trace of fear or curiosity. They simply existed there, like shadows with no past or future. Emily tried to rationalize. Maybe it was some kind of biological phenomenon, something that prevented physical deterioration. But her mind couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was going on. She felt watched, and not just by the eyes of the immortal crew, but by something invisible, something hiding in the walls of the station, something that wasn't willing to let anyone leave. The crew began to explore the station. The metal walls were polished, but in some places, small cracks appeared. The lighting was constantly on, even though there was no explanation for how a station so far out could maintain continuous power. However, the most unsettling thing was the behavior of the people. They moved on a strictly defined schedule, as if they were in a programmed routine. The station seemed to have a soul of its own, and its inhabitants were nothing more than puppets. When the captain and her team reached the control center, they found an even more baffling surprise. The place was empty. The systems were active, but no operators were in sight. On the control panel, only one message was visible: "Forgetting is not allowed. It was a simple phrase, but filled with a strange energy, as if it had been etched directly into the station, like an unexplainable command. Emily felt that the station was trying to communicate with her, but the message was vague, incomplete. She felt the pressure building in her mind, as if the walls were slowly closing in around her. It was as though something wanted to keep her there, trapped inside that labyrinth of metal and glass. Something that didn't want her to uncover Horizon's secret, but also didn't want to let her leave without understanding. In the following days, the crew was consumed by a growing sense of unease. The station, with its metal walls and empty corridors, seemed to be becoming increasingly claustrophobic. It was as if the spaces around them were compressing, and no matter how much they moved, they could never escape the feeling of being watched. Every corner seemed to hide something, a secret that refused to reveal itself, yet left an inexplicable presence behind. Conversations with the Horizon's inhabitants were superficial, always polite, but lacking depth. None of the scientists or engineers could provide a satisfactory explanation about their situation. When Emily questioned one of the senior scientists about the experiment they were conducting, he smiled distantly, almost emptily. "We're waiting," he said, offering no further explanation. "Waiting for what?" Emily asked, but the man just looked at her with a vacant gleam in his eyes, as if the question made no sense. The crew tried to conduct a deeper analysis. They examined the station systems, looking for any kind of malfunction, but everything was in perfect working order. The energy never ran out, food was never scarce, and even the temperature seemed precisely controlled, as if everything there had been designed not to fail. There were no signs of wear or deterioration, which made it all the more strange. During the night, something else began to happen. Emily started having vivid nightmares, dreams of voices whispering her name. She would wake up breathless, heart racing, but when she looked around, nothing seemed out of place. Then one morning, she found a mark on the wall of her room. It was a word written in dark, viscous ink that seemed to have materialized from nowhere. Forget. Frightened, she called Richard and the other crew members to investigate, but no one else found anything. Some even began to wonder if Emily's nightmares and visions were just a result of stress. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong, something trying to infiltrate her mind, destabilizing her perception of reality. The behavior of the Horizon's inhabitants also began to become increasingly peculiar. They were always at their posts, but rarely spoke. When they did speak, it was in short, mechanical answers, as if they were just fulfilling a function. Emily began to feel a growing sense of distrust. Why were they so calm? Why didn't they seem to care about the presence of visitors in their station? And more importantly, why did none of them seem to be wondering what had happened to the world outside? It was when one of the crew members, Samuel, found something unexpected. During an exploration of the corridors, he discovered a hidden room that was not on the station's maps. The room was filled with old monitors, covered in dust, with most of the systems shut down. In the center of the room, one screen was active, showing a static image, but with a disturbing detail. The image seemed to be from a room within the station, but with no one in it. Just an unsettling emptiness. Upon investigating further, Samuel found something even more disturbing, an encrypted data file. He tried to access it, but the station blocked his attempt. However, a simple message appeared on the screen before the system shut down. "Do not let them remember." Samuel rushed to Emily, visibly shaken. "Captain, you need to see this. Something's trying to hide the truth from us. Something's trying to erase our memory," he said, wide-eyed. Emily, unsure of what to think, followed him to the room. When she saw the screen, she felt a chill run down her spine. It was as if this was a warning, a message left by someone who had tried to escape from something they couldn't understand. The captain knew they were being deceived, but what tormented her more was a growing sense that they were being manipulated. The station was taking over them, altering their memories and distorting their perception of reality. And somewhere, between the metal corridors and the unyielding walls, was the secret that the Horizon's inhabitants could not or did not want to remember. That night, Emily found herself once again with the other crew members, all clearly uncomfortable, but the worst was yet to come. During an emergency meeting, one of the crew members, Engineer Laura, began speaking strangely, as if in a trance. She stared fixedly at Emily and, with an empty voice, said, "You can't escape. The station will never let you go." Before Emily could respond, Laura stood up and left the room, walking aimlessly as if guided by an invisible force. The captain followed her, but when she reached the corridor, she found no one. Everything was quiet, but something seemed to pulse in the air, something waiting for something more. The search for answers became an obsession for the crew. They were now aware that something was out of place, something deep and impossible to ignore. The strange behavior of the Horizon's inhabitants and the unsettling signs on the station's walls could no longer be explained by coincidences or technical failures. Something was manipulating everyone's perception, but no one knew how or why. Emily and Richard decided to hack into the station's central records, trying to find any clue that would explain what was happening. They accessed a hidden control panel, previously unknown, which appeared to have been installed after the arrival of the last crew. But as they tried to examine the data, they encountered something indescribable. There was an encrypted file, but not just any file. It was a series of images recorded in sequence, showing the very inhabitants of the station. In the images, the Horizon's inhabitants appeared at various moments in their lives. They seemed normal at first, but as the frames progressed, the expressions on their faces began to distort. It wasn't a natural change. It was as if they were being manipulated. It was as though something was draining their identities, erasing their memories, and forcing them to repeat the same gestures, the same words, without ever questioning what was happening. The real revelation came when the last image appeared, a scene from the station's control center, where Emily's crew was gathered, watching the recording in real time. They were there, but in a distorted version, as if they were observing themselves, prisoners of an infinite repetition. "What does this mean?" Richard murmured, his voice filled with disbelief. It was then that the station revealed its true face. The walls began to vibrate gently, as if an invisible presence was communicating with them, forcing them to understand a terrible truth. Horizon was not just a space station. It was a consciousness, a living organism that fed on the memories and identities of everyone who entered its space. Every decade, it received new visitors, extracted their essences, erased their stories, and began the cycle again. It was the death of everyone who arrived, but without the visitors ever knowing. They were alive, but not alive, trapped in an eternal limbo where they could neither age nor die. Emily felt an icy panic take over her body. "We're not here to live," she said, the words almost slipping from her mouth without her control. "We're here to be forgotten." But the truth seemed even more insidious. They were not just forgotten by the station. They were being disintegrated, their identity being deconstructed and absorbed by the machine itself, forcing them to live and relive the same moments, the same days, endlessly. Richard seemed to be struggling to maintain his sanity. He touched his forehead, trying to push away the feeling that his mind was falling apart. The station, it dominates us. It absorbs us. His voice was broken, and the tension on his face was palpable. Emily felt the same. Every part of her being was at odds with a reality she couldn't fully comprehend. But at the same time, something inside her resisted. She knew she couldn't be consumed by this force, not without a fight. In one final effort, Emily ran to the controls, trying to find a way to deactivate the station systems. But as she pressed a button, the lights began to flicker and a low siren sounded, as if the station was reacting to her attempt to escape. "No, we can't leave," Richard said, hysterically. "We'll never leave." The station, with its massive, threatening presence, seemed to feed off the hopelessness. Each attempt to escape, each effort to understand, only deepened the cycle of repetition. The walls began to move, as if the very structure of the station was alive, shifting shape, closing in on them. It was as if Horizon was tightening its grip around their bodies and minds, slowly draining their memories, their thoughts, until nothing remained. Emily looked at Richard, and a look of understanding passed between them. They were losing the battle. No matter how hard they fought, the station had won. "We're going to die here," she said, unwilling to believe what she was saying but knowing it was true. And then, with one last sigh of resignation, the station did the unthinkable. It erased their memories. When Emily woke up, she didn't know where she was. The last thing she remembered was the sound of the siren and the flickering lights. But now everything was silent. She slowly sat up, trying to process what had happened, but her mind was empty, as if it had been drained. The station around her seemed familiar, but at the same time, everything was new, as if none of it was real. She looked around, and the first thing she saw was Richard, sitting beside her, also waking up from a deep sleep. "Richard?" she said, her voice weak, as if she were trying to remember who he was. He looked at her with no recognition, and a forced smile appeared on his face. "Yes, Emily. Is everything okay?" It was strange. Emily didn't know what was wrong, but something felt completely out of place. They were there, in a room on the station, but everything seemed to have an aura of false normality. The metal walls were spotless. The lighting was constant, and no disturbing sound was present. The station seemed to have returned to its original state, but Emily knew something was wrong. She got up and began walking down the corridors, trying to find answers, but with each step, the sense of déjà vu intensified, as if she had lived these moments before. Every door she opened, every room she explored, was exactly the same as the last time she had visited it. The feeling of being trapped in a loop was unmistakable. "No! This can't be real," she murmured to herself, the words coming out almost like a lament. On her way, she found the other crew members all seeming calm, as if nothing had happened. They were acting strangely, but Emily didn't know what was happening. They didn't remember anything. They didn't remember what they had experienced or discovered, as if all the fear, panic, and tension had been erased from their minds. They were behaving as though they had just arrived at the station. It was when Emily found Laura that she was greeted with a distant look. "Have you recovered from the shock?" Laura asked, with no emotion in her voice. I don't understand," Emily replied, feeling her mind spin. "What happened? Where are we? What's going on with all of us?" Laura smiled, but strangely. "We're home," she said, with an enigmatic gleam in her eyes. "Now everything makes sense. The station is our home." Those words terrified her. It was as if they had been forced to forget, forced to accept a new reality, a reality that made no sense. Emily looked at Laura and felt a wave of despair. The truth was there, but no one else seemed able to see it. "You don't remember anything?" Emily asked desperately. "Everything we went through? Everything we discovered?" Laura looked at her with a calm expression, but her eyes were empty. "No, Emily. There's nothing to remember. There's nothing but this station. We're all here now, and that's all that matters." That's when the reality of their situation hit Emily. She had forgotten, not just the events she had lived through, but the very nature of what they were experiencing. The station wasn't just erasing their memories. It was shaping them, forcing them into an endless cycle, a cycle of forgetfulness where the truth could never be discovered. They were living in a lie that seemed perfect, but was nothing more than a mental prison. Emily began running through the station's corridors, her mind now in panic, trying to remember everything she had learned. She knew there was something more, something that couldn't be ignored. But as she ran, everything began to disappear. The station's walls began to distort, shrink, and expand, as if being manipulated by an invisible force. She felt as though she was being pulled back to something, to a memory she couldn't reach. Suddenly, she found herself back in the same room, sitting again beside Richard. He looked at her and smiled, as if nothing had happened. "Are you okay, Emily?" he asked. "Yes, I think so," she replied, her mind spinning in complete confusion. But in that moment, a word flashed in her mind, a word she couldn't understand, but that was there, echoing in her head. Forget. It was as if the station was feeding off her resistance, forcing her to accept what she didn't want to believe. They were trapped, but not in a normal time cycle. They were trapped in a cycle of the mind where the station, with its consciousness and power, shaped their memories, erased and restarted, keeping them trapped in an eternal loop. Every attempt to escape, every attempt to understand, only threw them back into the same room, the same starting point. And so, the station continued its mission. It never aged, never died. And the crew always returned, never remembering why, never knowing they had already been consumed by the same distorted reality. Emily finally understood the terrible secret of Horizon. Death was not a possibility. Forgetfulness was. They were living in eternal forgetfulness, a cycle where the station would never let them escape, and where they would be doomed to relive the same moments forever.